A lot of them were locally produced. Well, you have to understand that the natives, I mean, had their own art traditions. They had painting. They had mural painting for thousands of years. So cochineal changes European art practices. It's red. It comes from the Americas. And this is something the natives were using. You know, one of the things to kind of keep in mind is that the Americas weren't just the source for raw materials that were sent to Europe for processing. Europe becomes a market for a lot of American products. You know, cochineal becomes a huge industry. Chocolate. There's a whole history around food. Chocolate's a native beverage. Yeah, the little bug. Yeah, it forms the red. Yeah, and there's also a kind of indigo that's made from snails, you know, that also takes Europe by storm. So there are pigments the natives use that are unknown in Europe, but then European artists begin to demand these. They're very expensive because they have to be exported, but artists use these pigments, and they're American products coming from indigenous practices. Okay, they're cultivated during the colonial period especially. And then you have the foods. Vanilla. What are the foods that come from the Americas? Chocolate, vanilla, tomatoes, corn, potatoes. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Think about how these things changed. Where would Italian cooking be without tomatoes? You know, the Mexican tomato. Chocolate. You know, the whole body of scholarship around chocolate. That's part of colonial studies. We're talking about food history and all the different foods or other products that are actually American that are taken back to Europe. You know, the Americas are not just a source for raw materials. They're also producers, and Europe becomes a market for American products during the colonial period. Dyes, we're talking about the dyes, the cochineal, indigo from these snails. These pigments become popular in Europe, but they're expensive because they have to be exported across seas. And then the foods, you know, chocolate being the big one, but also vanilla is also native. You know, there are a number of other things. And then when what's interesting about, I have to deviate because I love the history of chocolate. But one of the interesting things is that chocolate, there were like sumptuary laws among the Aztec. They're a hierarchical imperial society. Only nobles could consume chocolate. The common population could not consume chocolate. And we know that the Emperor Moctezuma liked his chocolate chilled. They had a form of refrigeration. They would bring ice down from the snow-capped volcanoes and have refrigerators, and he liked his chocolate chilled. And there were like 30 different ways to prepare it with flowers and spices and honey and different kinds of things. So chocolate was sort of like the Japanese tea ceremony. It was a very elaborate kind of beverage that only nobles could consume. During the colonial period, with the disruption of Aztec society, then chocolate consumption spreads. And initially the Spaniards hated it because it was brown and they drink it very thick. It's almost like coffee, and they thought it was gross, you know. So the Spanish hated it at first, but then the Creoles, the people who were born here, you know, for all the descendants of American Spanish settlers, who raises these kids? Were their native nannies. You know, then they're black wet nurses. I mean, they're raised within a culture that's informed by native food and native language. This is where the change starts to occur. You know, that the white ruling class in places like New Spain are raised by natives. They live around natives. They eat native food. They know native language. You know, so their tastes are informed by native aesthetics. And they start to drink chocolate. You know, and then they start to kind of change it a little bit. And then you go to the markets in the main plaza, and you see chocolate sellers. There's a certain way to make it. You have to make it frothy. It has to be frosty. There's like that's a ritual. There's a ritual. Only women can sell it. Native and black women can sell chocolate in the market. Chocolate is taken back to Spain. The Spaniards hate it. You know, it gets associated with witchcraft. You know, at first, you know, because of the caffeine. I mean, real chocolate, not the milk chocolate stuff, but real chocolate will wire you. It's like cocaine. It has so much caffeine. Yeah.
Did they sweeten it?
In Europe, once they added sugar and milk, then it took off. You know.
So that was a European thing, though.
Yeah.
So
But they did sweeten it over here. They did sweeten it, but over there they added sugar. They were trying to emulate. When Europeans started gaining a taste for chocolate, because first it was associated with witchcraft, so like, no. Then it was seen as a medicine. Because of the caffeine, it was seen as sort of inspiring your libido and curing your depression. It's all caffeine related. So it becomes like a pharmaceutical. Okay? And then they start adding, they want to drink it like the Aztec do, like the Mexicans do. So Europe becomes a market for American-produced chocolate cups and stir. There's a certain cup that you use and a stirrer. So these objects are made here by natives and exported to Europe, where they're bought up by nobles. You see Spanish still life painting, and you'll see it. There's a little cup. It's like a saucer attached to a cup. And there's like a little, that's Mexican.
It was produced here.
Yeah. Oh, and then they start copying them in Europe, like out of like different materials, like porcelain and whatnot. But that saucer that's attached to the cup with the stir, that's Mexican. you know, but you see it in still lifes. You'll see Mexican ceramics pop up in Spanish 17th century still lifes, you know, because they want to drink it like the Mexicans do. And a lot of the ingredients that the Mexicans would add, they don't survive a 3-month journey across sea. You know, the flours and the spice, they just don't last. So they started adding refined sugar. That was more easily, also an American product, but they started adding sugar and then milk. And once they did that, then it just took off. Yeah, and became this world-dominating food product that it is today. You know, but it's a Mexican product. And there are other cases where I can point out different types of colonial products that are exported. Europe becomes a market for American-produced goods.
On chocolate that you would recommend?
Yeah, yeah. What's his name? He's a Mayanist. His last name is Coe, C-O-E. He and his wife. If you Google Coe chocolate, they published a book that's all about the history of chocolate. There are,
But I take my AP World History kids to Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. And
Sure.
the whole thing and all that, after Ortiz. But when we went last time to Chaco Canyon, they had chocolate there in several of the.
oh yeah, they discovered
big
residue,
boxes. Yeah,
chocolate
they found
residue.
in the
Yeah.
bottom of this. And
That
they
predates
said
contact.
It was evidence of trade because
Yeah.
there's no way that they
Yeah.
grew it.
No, it didn't grow. It needs a
It's in the middle of
a
the
tropical environment. You know, that's a whole other kind of topic of conversation that's fascinating, is that before the Europeans arrived, there was extensive trade across the Americas. They have found, I think, Aztec artifacts in the Midwest. In Mexico, they've discovered sort of patterns, textile patterns, that are clearly coming from South America. So objects were moving around, as well as food products. Yeah, and that was an astounding discovery, that chocolate had made it that far north. But it makes sense. It was like a luxury commodity for rulers.
So you said that the Europeans added sugar, so the natives never added.
They added sweetener. I mean, like honey and like certain kinds of spices and whatnot. But it's the Europeans that sweetened it. The way we understand it, it was the Europeans that sweetened it and added milk, you know, which the natives didn't have. So that's the beginning of the industry as we know it today. Yeah.